There's a Superman reboot on the horizon, and this time, instead of a Christopher Reeve sound-alike, we're getting a Henry Cavill look-alike. Yes, believe it or not, we're just about a year away from James Gunn's take on the Man of Tomorrow. And along with his new DCU comes plenty of predictable controversy. As expected, plot details and set photos are falling all around us like we're in the debris field from our last Superman film, which came out so long ago now I sorta had to do a double take. As is the case with every comic book movie of all time, for as long as Hollywood has been making comic book movies, some people are excited, and some people are not. And as is usually the case with every comic book movie of all time, the people who are not excited are louder and more annoying. To be fair, I'm not saying there aren't things to complain about. There's always something you can complain about. I'm just saying, of course you're finding things to complain about when you're not even looking at a finished product. That's why I prefer to just hop on the hype train and enjoy the ride before any potentially disappointing developments result in another franchise-derailing dud. We've been all over the place with this character. As someone whose earliest memory of the Kryptonian is from constantly rewatching Superman 4, The Quest for Peace on VHS, I'm very aware of his rocky cinematic history. But I have a lot of faith in James Gunn and his vision for the DCU, and based on the stories that have been hinted at so far, we might already have film adaptations of some of the comics that inspired what we see in theaters around this time next year. Starting off on the suspected plot elements being borrowed, we have Superman vs. the Elite, an animated adaptation of 2001's What's So Funny About Truth, Justice, and the American Way. It was the new millennium, a time when comics readership was arguably becoming more bloodthirsty in their taste for superheroics. This was thanks in large part to ultra-violent anti-hero group The Authority, who was introduced in 1999 by Warren Ellis and, no big surprise here, Mark Miller. Gunn hasn't been shy about The Authority's involvement in his upcoming cinematic universe, and it stands to reason that their direct counterparts, The Elite, would provide similar story threads. Kingdom Come has been a rumored inspiration for the project and could arguably have more direct influence on what we see in the final film, but they haven't adapted that into a cartoon yet, so this feels like a more appropriate comparison for the sake of this video. Interestingly, on the topic of Kingdom Come, Brandon Routh portrayed a version of Kal-El that drew heavily on Alex Ross's interpretation in the Arrowverse's adaptation of Crisis on Infinite Earths. In this not-for-kids cartoon of the now nearly 25-year-old story from the original comic run, Superman is forced to stand against the manipulated morals of the people he's choosing to protect. Respectably grounded in his belief that all life is worth saving, he faces abandonment by the people he devotes his life to keeping safe. With no expectation of reward or compensation, the public is turning their back on arguably their most iconic hero and openly bashing his moral code, because if the death of one terrorist can potentially prevent the deaths of many innocents, who's to say that's not the best course of action? This point is argued well enough throughout this blocky but beautifully animated film that feels just as politically relevant today as it did in the original comic run, over 2 decades ago. Don't let the abstract animation style fool you. This movie might look like it's intended for a younger demographic, but it's far from appropriate for all ages. Either way, it becomes quite the visual feast during its intense, occasionally shocking action sequences. There are some pretty disturbing moments that I'd normally file under gratuitous. The interesting thing is, where a lot of these animated movies seem to use violence for the sake of flexing their freedom from censorship, this all feels relatively warranted here, where the topic of the day is essentially ethical murder and the societal ramifications of promoting it, along with the violence that accompanies that thought process. Bodies are twisted, bones are broken, brains are melted, and the characters are appropriately horrified. Along with the group's leader, Manchester Black, there's Coldcast, Menagerie, and the Hat. All of them apparently have troubled pasts, though only Manchester's is shown, and each one comes with a superpowered personality disorder, with Menagerie constantly spouting off blatant sexual innuendos and Hat's frequent binge drinking between Magic Dragon displays. It's hard to imagine this team ever getting into the public eye as a hero group in the first place. The subject of whether or not to kill in the line of superhero duty is one frequently debated within the comics themselves, and that will likely continue for the duration of the industry's relevance to society. Superman has long been exclusively devoted to keeping life alive, so when Manchester Black starts brain-bolting terrorists 20 feet away, it understandably hits a nerve. Words are exchanged, threats are made, war is declared. Watching Superman reach his breaking point has a gravity to it that's hard to articulate. It's weirdly scary and satisfying to see what happens when someone so dedicated to being good finally snaps. Especially someone with such unearthly power. With how overplayed the idea of an evil Superman has been in recent years, I wouldn't expect these moments to have the impact that they do, but I honestly got chills at some of what I witnessed from this pissed-off Kryptonian farm boy. It never talks down to its audience, the violence feels far less gratuitous than it should, and the voice work is all great. And the character topics are relatable. If you don't care about Superman's relevance as a moral compass, this may not change your mind, but it might give you a fresh perspective. Up next is All-Star Superman, adapting a popular comic book character to the big screen or the small screen, whether it be animated or live action, can be difficult enough, but adapting a specific story directly becomes real tricky business. As a reflection of the golden age stories from a lighter era in Superman's nearing a century-long existence, this arc is especially beloved across the fan base, young and old, given how perfectly it captures the essence of the character. I can see why James Gunn would pull from this interpretation for several elements, and I'm actually hopeful for the inclusion of a moment from the comic that didn't make it to the cut for the animated version. It's a powerful few frames that depict who Superman really is as a human being, and does so better than some other interpretations manage to in their full duration. And despite the desired scene's absence, this release does a nice job of streamlining the core story of the comic, nixing unnecessary tangents, and injecting just enough new material to avoid being a simple copy-paste effort from page to screen. If we do happen to get anything close to a scene-for-scene moment from the 2025 release, my money's on the opening montage, with Lex Luthor narrating the main beats of Superman's origin. A good use of world-building exposition to keep everyone up to date on the current universe's continuity. And it might be wise for James Gunn to use something like this to avoid confusion, otherwise there could be a few viewers who still think Zod showed up a decade or so ago. Anyway, speaking of Lex Luthor, he's never one to be left out of the spotlight, and he has a major part to play in a few of Clark's forthcoming headaches. Every interaction between these two is pitch perfect. From Clark's interview with Lex at Stryker's Island prison to their final superpowered confrontation, these characters play off each other like well-rehearsed poetry, somehow avoiding entirely cliché vibes along the way. I can only hope for this kind of character interaction and chemistry between the new live-action counterparts of these iconic nemeses. As well-received as Grant Morrison's original 12-issue run of All-Star Superman was, it was naturally not very believable that 75 minutes would be enough to capture the emotional resonance and charm found in the source material. All things considered, and given the runtime's limited room to breathe, this does a commendable job. When it comes to the version we'll inevitably get from Gunn, I think in terms of what it takes from this comic specifically, it'll have a lot more to do with character elements than the story. It's one of the better interpretations of Superman's dual identity, and it nails his overall demeanor, both in terms of authority and tenderness. As Superman, he can have a stern but friendly impact, and the disguise he implements as Clark Kent is flawlessly flawed, in all the most perfectly distracting ways. It really makes you believe these characters could be seen as separate people in a way that only Christopher Reeve has achieved on screen to date. If what we see on the big screen come July of next year happens to resemble some combination of elements from these specific comics, it'll be interesting to have an alternate adaptation to compare with the animated releases, and if it doesn't, I can't say I'll give it much additional thought. Frankly, I'll just be happy when I can see Superman in theaters again after far too long.